Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gildardo Lopez wash processed Colombia from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario. And this coffee is the other half of our April 2025 Coffee of the Month nominees, as this one won our YouTube poll as the coffee you most wanted to see us review. And the best thing about each of these coffees winning their respective poll is that it gave us an opportunity to compare and contrast them from two coffee roasters side by side. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one does compare to the thankfully Gildardo Lopez, as this right here is day 58. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually the same as our thankfully coffee, which was a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the V60, which once again does indicate a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So as we mentioned, they are both on the extra light side of the spectrum for both of these coffee roasters, and Kyle has asked us in the past to emphasize the fact that this is not their standard profile for their coffees, as there have been some people that have reached out to September asking about these extra light offerings. So this one right here isn't standard, and it's not something that you can get all the time when it comes to September. And even then, they are still one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters in the entirety of Canada and North America in general. As I mentioned, that I also got a sample of the standard profile of this Gildardo Lopez, which was still a very light coffee, but this one right here did feel just a slight bit lighter than the experience that we did have from Thankfully, which once again, also on the extra light side of that spectrum. So for that reason, we can say that this coffee did skew on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 30, first impression through the V60, and the biggest differentiating factor between this one and the Thankfully one was that there was a little bit more of a tomato-like aroma in the brew that did translate a little bit more into the cup itself. Otherwise, it was expectedly more Kenyan-like with lighter qualities, as it felt a slight bit grainy right off brew. Pretty bright as expected, but on par with our expectations overall. So that's kind of what I'm alluding to in the lightness of the profile of these two coffees, is I didn't experience that same sort of savory quality to it, and I didn't experience that same sort of grainy quality with the Thankfully version of this coffee. So that would indicate this one being just a little bit lighter than the experience that we had from the Thankfully coffee. Day 33 through the Chemex, and the coffee is much better this time around, as there's significantly less of the tomato qualities in the cup itself, offering a cleaner and sweeter representation. Finish offers a lovely sugary quality to contrast an otherwise Kenyan-like brightness. Listen, cotton candy felt very apt, as there's a very strong sugary quality to this one. So this was a very lovely day of this coffee. And based off the first two impressions that I did have from both of these coffee roasters, it really made me think that one of these coffees I preferred a fair bit with the V60, which was the Thankfully coffee, and then the other one I preferred a fair bit with the Chemex based off the first couple of tries. So I was wondering if that was going to hold true from that point going forward. So on day 36, we opted for the UFO brewer, and the coffee was slightly more tame this time around, with an experience much closer to the first try, as there was a notable tomato-like aspect once again. Cool down is excellent though, as it does offer a much more prominent sugary quality, so a nice day overall. And as far as the experiences that we've had from these coffees, I think it's worth noting that I brewed the Thankfully coffee on one day, and then 2 days after I would brew the September coffee. So I was trying them basically on the same day. So for example, the day 30 day, which was the first time I brewed this coffee, the Thankfully coffee I brewed for the first time 2 days before that. So they were on the same trajectory, just 2 days apart. And as a result, I was kind of seeing these coffees side by side for the most part. I wasn't brewing them on the same day, but I was brewing them in the same sequential order. So the first day, the second day, third day, so on and so forth. Day 39 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments. So that's the main reason we decided to go with the same adjustments that we did with the Thankfully coffee. And it did feel it was slightly over extracted, if I'm being completely honest, but it's still very nice, as it's a little reminiscent this time around of the, say, Pepe Trioxidator coffee that we had recently reviewed, with a focus being on the red fruit qualities and a strong sweetness as the coffee does cool down. Very sweet in the finish. This was very, very sweet when we experienced it on this day. So definitely another very solid day. And that did give some merit to pushing this coffee, as it did seem to help with some of the sugary sweetness within the finish. But we'll kind of get into that a little bit more as we go through this review. Day 42 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee continues to perform very well in this brew method as it's offering plenty of the sweet dissolved sugar candy finish to it. Right at the forefront, as the coffee does have some nice balance to it altogether, less savory in this brew method as well, and that's been pretty consistent based off the experience that we've had from September. Day 45 through the V60 with the lower extraction adjustment, so 15 to 1 at 94 Celsius. So we did the exact same thing that we had done with the Thankfully coffee. And the coffee was also the best it had been to this point, especially with the V60, as it has toned down some of the savory and bright qualities to it. And it really did seem to help this coffee significantly more than the Thankfully one, largely because we were experiencing just a little bit more tomato in this coffee than we had experienced from the Thankfully coffee. Best B60 up to this point, as it does have a very strong dissolved sugar feel yet again. So it also felt like this coffee was improving with time, which was also consistent with our experience with the Thankfully coffee. Day 48 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was the best it had been for this brew method, as well as offering a greater focus on the sugary qualities, toning down the citric brightness and intensity. So that's also consistent with our Thankfully experience. And getting to this point with both these coffees, it really did feel a little redundant, if I'm being completely honest, given that these coffees were just so similar as you would probably expect. And making the same adjustments and seeing the same results with both these coffees was also very interesting to me, but in theory, it's what you probably would expect with something like this. Day 51 final notes we did opt for the V60 with the lower extraction adjustments, and there has been a very nice level of consistency to this coffee. And given that it felt like we went through 16 days of brewing the exact same coffee and getting 16 results that were pretty much in line with mirroring each other, it was just kind of interesting to see how this one turned out, as it's still offering plenty of the berry, citric, and candied qualities to it, especially with that dissolved sugary sense and a very prominent finish with an almost red lollipop feel. It's kind of funny. I did not realize that I wrote the same thing for the Thankfully review that I did for this one, but very slight savoriness to this as well. So just kind of an interesting contrast to these two coffees, as it offered so many similarities. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. I honestly did not realize I wrote that red lollipop note for both of these coffees. All right, let's go through this tasting wheel. So I mentioned in our Thankfully review that there was only one thing that differed from these two coffees, and that is the caramel here as level 3, as it did feel a little bit more dissolved sugary sweet on the final day when we did make the tasting wheel for this coffee than it did with the Thankfully coffee. I mentioned that it could have been a result of a slight misbrew, as it did feel a little bit more citric forward than we had experienced up to that point. So that's worth noting. And I even mentioned that it could probably be higher. It could probably be at that level 3 mark. So I made these tasting wheels 2 days apart, and it's just interesting to me that they were so similar. I looked at them for the first time side by side when we recorded that Thankfully review, just before we recorded that Thankfully review. And let's go through this tasting wheel though. A lot of similarities. Cleanliness, level 4, very clean cup of coffee. Even though this one did offer a slight bit more savoriness to it, it still was clean enough, especially after we toned down that quality to it specifically, that it justified that level 4 mark. Really don't have too much to add to that. Finish, level 4. This one did have, I would say, if anything, a slight bit more of that sugary cotton candy-like sweetness to it within the finish. And for that reason, I did enjoy the finish, maybe a slight bit more on certain days when it came to this coffee, but even then, I would say that the difference is pretty negligible. Finish, sweetness, level 4, same thing, very sweet, higher side of the level 4, especially as far as pink bourbon coffees go. So that was definitely one of the best qualities of this coffee. And in the same way that Thankfully Gildardo Lopez was pretty versatile, this one was also pretty versatile. You can kind of tone that down, tone up the acidity based off the way you want to brew it. And same thing with the acidity, level 4. I feel like you can't really escape the fact that this coffee is going to be pretty bright in general. If anything, you can make it even more bright, but for the most part, it's going to kind of bottom out at that level 4, as this one, even with some toned down adjustments, was still a pretty bright coffee in general. Florality, level 4, same thing. I felt plenty of the floral qualities in this one in a red sense, so I'm still thinking a little bit more of the rose. I could also see hibiscus, as this one did have a slight bit more of an herbal quality when compared to the Thankfully, but even then it's very minimal, not to the extent where it's such a noticeable difference between these two. Berry fruit, level 4, yeah, same notes on this one. This one's also strawberry, so makes a lot of sense with it, as it's presented in that very sugary sense as well, also lacking that same sort of fermentiness that I can get from Colombian coffee, so works for me, happy with that. Citrus fruit, level 4, I mentioned that in the Thankfully review, my least favorite part of this coffee. I could give or take the very strong, tart, bright, lime-like citrus that is present within this coffee. Bitter is the word I'm looking for. Not my favorite part of it, but still pretty prominent regardless of what sort of adjustments we made. If anything, if you push this coffee, I feel like the citrus was probably outshining the berry quality within this one just a little bit. And then a couple things worth discussing, level 3s. We'll go with the body first real quick. Same thing, medium bodied cup of coffee. And that was, I would say, pretty expected given what this coffee was. And then the final thing worth discussing, though I mentioned it briefly, was that the caramels there at the level 3 mark, largely because just when making this tasting wheel, it felt a little bit more sugary than I'd remembered from our experience with the Thankfully coffee. So that's where we opted to put it. Outside of that, though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This is the opportunity to compare and contrast the two, and these coffees were extraordinarily similar, if I'm being completely honest. And the two big takeaways and differences I noticed between them was that the September one did feel a slight bit more savory. Like I didn't experience pretty much any tomato-like characteristics or savory qualities from the Thankfully version of this coffee. But at the same time, this one felt a little bit better through the Chemex most of the time, where I didn't necessarily get the best Chemex results with the Thankfully coffee. And I would say that it was a little bit more consistent with the V60 for the Thankfully coffee, as I didn't get those same sort of savory qualities. So going into it, one of them did feel most of the time better through the V60, which was the Thankfully coffee. And then the other one felt a little bit better through the Chemex the majority of the time, which was the September coffee. But even then, they both shared the exact same profile and characteristics to them in terms of the very berry, citric, and sugary qualities throughout the entirety. And the notes that we wrote down for these coffees were also extremely similar. Like I didn't even realize just how similar a lot of the notes we had were for the entirety of the time that we were working on them. So even then, tasting wheels also extremely similar. I said that this one probably felt a little bit more sugary sweet towards the end, but even then it was just such a small difference based off the time that we were working through it. I feel like if you would have given me the same coffee, I want to say cupped it like 8-9 different cups of this coffee, 5 of which from September, 5 of which from Thankfully, and I would have a difficult time picking out which one was which just because of how similar these coffees were in general. So truth be told, I didn't have a preference, honestly. There were certain days, probably a lot of the Chemex days where I enjoyed this one a little bit more, some of the V60 days where I enjoyed the Thankfully one a little bit more, but at the end of the day, I genuinely don't have a preference between these two. I think that they were both actually quite nice. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, I mentioned the lighter profile of it, and it didn't play as significant a role as I might have expected based off of some of the earlier results. So that graininess I felt like might have translated throughout the entirety of this one, but it really didn't. It seemed to dissipate after the first time we brewed it. So outside of that, it is offering plenty of those Kenyan-like characteristics to it, plenty of sweeter qualities, plenty of cleaner qualities to it, as the savoriness did seem to dissipate with a little bit of time. I'm not entirely sure if it's a result of us toning this one down or if it's a result of this coffee just kind of aging that out with time. Either way, definitely skewing more on that cleaner, sweeter, Kenyan-like experience to it with plenty of those sugary qualities as well and a lighter profile. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gildardo Lopez wash processed Colombia from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.